In a quiet corner of a cemetery outside Chicago, a patch of earth has been slowly sinking for 17 years. Beneath it lies a man, buried with no headstone, no flowers, no name. Just a number etched into a temporary marker that no one visits except now. That number once stood in for a son, a brother, a father of three. His name was Eli González, but for nearly 2 decades, no one in the city that buried him knew that. Not the coroner, not the police, not even the morgue that stored his body before filing it under unidentified mail. And so the earth claimed him quietly, while hundreds of miles away in Puerto Rico, his family kept asking questions no one could answer. What happened to Gene? Why did he disappear just days after landing in Chicago? Why couldn't anyone tell them where he went? For years, the calls went out like prayers to hospitals, shelters, detox centers, police departments. His sisters searched until their voices turned hoarse and their fingertips raw from dialing. Each time they said his name, they were told, gently or coldly, that there was no match, no file, no record. And eventually, as time passed, their fear twisted into something worse, something heavier than grief, unknowing. That's the part people underestimate, not the tragedy itself, but the vacuum it leaves behind. When there's no explanation, no remains, no witness, you live in the ache between theories. Did he relapse? Was he killed? Is he wandering somewhere with no memory, no ID, just a scar and a name he can't recall?
Long before his name was lost in a morgue file, before his face became a forensic sketch on a database, Eli González was just a boy, growing up in a crowded house on a quiet street in Puerto Rico. His family lived in Humacao, a municipality along the island's eastern coast. It wasn't a rich neighborhood, but it had rhythm, the kind that came from tight bonds, midday salsa echoing through open windows, and the unspoken promise that no matter how hard things got, your people had your back. Gene's people always had his back. But more than that, he had theirs. He was the kind of kid who walked in with scraped knees and a laugh that made it hard to stay mad. The kind who'd share the last spoonful of arroz con gandules with a sibling who hadn't eaten. He was protective, especially for his sisters. The youngest one, Vilmariles, followed him everywhere. Wherever Gene went, she went, and Gene never seemed to mind. There's a story that gets told a lot in the Gonzalez household. It happened when Gene was in his teens. One afternoon, he noticed a group of older boys bullying some younger kids near a basketball court. Gene didn't know the kids, but that didn't matter. He stepped in, without hesitation, words first, fists if necessary. One of the bullies pulled a knife. Gene took a blade to the chest for strangers. He survived. But the scar stayed with him, a reminder, stitched into the skin above his heart and maybe into his soul, that he was someone who stood between danger and the defenseless. It wasn't bravado, it was instinct, and that instinct would shape every chapter of his life that followed. As Gene entered his 20s, life came fast, too fast. There were jobs, but they didn't last. There were bills, and they piled up. And before he could catch his breath, Gene became a father, then a father again, and again. By 23, he had 3 children depending on him. The island, with all its beauty, had begun to close in. For men like Gene, young, broke, stretched between obligation and regret, temptation doesn't come all at once. It shows up slowly, disguised as relief. Some nights, it's a drink. Other nights, a pill. Something to dull the anxiety of being expected to hold everyone together when you feel like you're falling apart. That's when Gene started using. His family noticed the changes, subtle at first. He was tired more often, distant. Money vanished faster than it should have. But he wasn't reckless. He still showed up. He still smiled. Still held his kids like they were made of glass. But something in him had cracked. What made Gene different was that he didn't try to hide it. He admitted it, said it straight. I need help. He didn't want his children to grow up seeing him like that. Didn't want them to wonder what kind of man their father was. He wanted to stop, not someday, but now. And so when someone told him about a program that could help, a Christian-run recovery mission based in Chicago, with beds, structure, and Spanish-speaking staff, he jumped at it. The organization promised something called Segunda Vida, a second life. They said it would give him a fresh start, far from bad influences, with the discipline and faith to start over. It sounded right. Clean. Holy, even. His mother was hesitant. Chicago was far. He had no family there. But Gene insisted. This was the right thing, he said. For him. For his kids. So they scraped together the money. A one-way ticket. A little cash. A prayer. On September 15, 2007, Gene boarded a plane and flew to the mainland. When he landed, he made one phone call. It was short. He told his mother he had arrived. He sounded okay, said he'd call again soon. He never did. Back in Humacao, the days passed without word. Then a week, then 2. His mother tried the number he'd called from. Nothing. No answer. She reached out to the organization, Segunda Vida. They said he hadn't arrived, or maybe he had and left. The story shifted. No one gave a straight answer. And somewhere deep in her bones, she knew something was wrong. The family started making calls. First locally, then to Chicago. Shelter hotlines, detox clinics, police. They faxed photos, left voicemails, shared Gene's name with anyone who might listen. But the city gave them silence. Worse, it gave them cold bureaucracy. When they tried to file a missing person report, they were dismissed. Because Gene was an adult. Because he had a history of drug use. Because the people in charge didn't see urgency. Just another brown man from another place, missing in a city already drowning in crime stats. Vilmarilis was only a teenager at the time, but even she could hear the condescension in the voices on the other end of the line, the polite brush-offs, the unspoken judgments, and so the search became their own. Year after year, they kept looking. When Facebook groups for missing persons started gaining traction, Vilmarilis joined every one. She posted Gene's photo, shared his story, replied to every tip, no matter how thin. She kept going, even when hope shriveled to a whisper. Because Gene was more than a case, more than a file. He was her brother. And she had made a promise. She would find him, or die trying.
If you ask someone how a person disappears in America, they'll usually picture the wilderness, maybe a vast forest, maybe a national park, a lone hiker, a wrong turn, no witnesses, no signal. That's how people vanish, right? But Eli González didn't disappear in a forest. He disappeared in a city of nearly 3 million people, less than a mile from a functioning police department, in full view of a billboard. And no one saw. Or if they did, no one remembered. After his final call home, everything went silent. Not just from Gene, but from the organization that was supposed to receive him. Segunda Vida. The name, in hindsight, was bitterly ironic. They claimed they'd never heard of him, or that he'd arrived but left, or maybe that he'd never checked in. Stories shifted depending on who picked up the phone. What was clear is that they didn't file any report, didn't notify anyone when he failed to return, didn't even record him in their intake log. Whatever promise of structure and salvation they had sold to Gene unraveled within days. And yet, this wasn't just about one program failing one man. What happened next exposed something far larger, a system so fragmented, so indifferent to the margins of society that even when someone died in public, they could still vanish on paper. Here's what we now know. On September 17, 2007, just 2 days after Gene's plane landed, a body was discovered in an alley near Chicago's South Side, hanging. No ID, a note in his pocket, a name written there in shaky, uneven handwriting, Gene Eli González. He hadn't overdosed. He hadn't gone missing into thin air. He'd been found, clearly, tragically. The responding officers filed a report. The body was transported to the Cook County Medical Examiner's office, and autopsy was performed. Cause of death? Suicide by hanging. The report noted that he was likely of Hispanic descent, possibly Puerto Rican. The note was logged, but dismissed. No official document could verify the name, and so by default, the man became John Doe number 428. Case closed. He was buried days later in Homewood Memorial Gardens, a cemetery where the county sent the unclaimed, the unknown, the discarded. What they didn't do is perhaps the most unforgivable part. They didn't check missing persons reports from Puerto Rico. They didn't contact federal agencies to verify the name. They didn't notify Spanish-language media or attempt outreach through consulates or Latino community groups. They didn't even upload his case to NamUs, the national database for unidentified decedents. And so the body of a man whose name was literally in his pocket vanished into institutional oblivion. Meanwhile, back in Puerto Rico, Gene's family kept pushing. They filed reports in San Juan. They faxed documents to Chicago police. They called and called and called. But each time they were told the same thing. No match. No body found. No leads. How could there be? The case wasn't in the system. The system they were depending on didn't even know it had him. And that's the cruel irony. The Gonzalez family wasn't failed by bad luck or even by malice. They were failed by absence of communication, of cultural understanding, of urgency, of care. No one picked up the thread that had been dropped in that alley. No one thought to ask why a man would die beneath a billboard, carrying a note with a full name, and still be called a mystery. And then the years passed. The case went cold, not in the dramatic way television portrays, with files boxed and detectives haunted, but in the quieter, more bureaucratic way. A number went into a ledger. A burial invoice was stamped. A face was forgotten. Even as Gene's family continued to advocate, the silence from Chicago grew thicker. To the system, he had never existed. To the people who loved him, he was everywhere. His children grew older without knowing what happened. His sisters marked birthdays and death days, not knowing which was which. And in Cook County, the file remained sealed in a database that no one searched because no one knew to. It wasn't until 2023 that something began to shift. A new initiative inside the Cook County Medical Examiner's office was launched,
not out of any connection to Jean's case, but as part of a broader policy change. They began digitizing old unidentified remains cases, uploading files to NamUs for the first time in decades. Some called it a long overdue correction. Others called it a miracle. For families like Jean's, it became a lifeline. But the lifeline came too late to spare them the years of uncertainty, the aching silence, the weight of not knowing. What it did offer was a crack in the wall, a small, flickering light. And through that crack, a truth long buried began to rise.
For some families, grief begins with the body. For the Gonzalez family, grief began with silence. Because silence leaves room for everything: hope, dread, anger, delusion, and worst of all, waiting. When Jean vanished, his mother and sisters didn't light candles and whisper eulogies. They printed flyers. They took shifts combing shelters. They showed up, physically, digitally, emotionally, in every space that might offer even the thinnest thread. At first, they assumed there had been a mistake. He'd just arrived in Chicago. Maybe he got turned around. Maybe his phone was stolen. Maybe he was in a hospital under a different name. Or maybe, just maybe, he had gotten cold feet and decided to come home but didn't know how to say it. Pride, after all, is its own prison. Weeks passed. Then months. Vilmariles kept his photo in her wallet. Jean's mother stopped answering unknown numbers, not out of apathy, but because each time it wasn't him, it cut deeper. One sister learned how to draft FOIA requests. Another figured out how to search Cook County's inmate database. They pieced together a system of hope, rotating duties, tracking calls, archiving case numbers in notebooks smudged with fingerprints and coffee stains. They refused to stop. And if you've never searched for someone, really searched, you don't understand what it does to your world, the way it warps time, how every stranger's face holds a possibility, how every headline about a found body snaps your breath short, how even sleep turns cruel, because dreams give him back, only for the waking to take him again. There were moments when it almost felt like they were closing in. In 2009, 2 years after his disappearance, someone messaged Vilmariles saying they'd seen a man matching Jean's description in a downtown soup kitchen. She flew to Chicago, walked the streets, visited the center, asked around, showed pictures. But the man wasn't there. No one had seen him. Or, if they had, they didn't remember. In 2011, a tip came from a church group. Again, it led nowhere. In 2013, a private investigator offered to help for a reduced fee. He was well-meaning, but ultimately ineffective. The trail had gone too cold. Social media became both a tool and a torment. Facebook, Reddit, online forums. They offered reach, but also disinformation. Strangers gave cruel suggestions. Trolls mocked their efforts. Some accused Jean of abandoning his children. Others hinted at gang involvement. All speculation. None helpful. And through it all, Segunda Vida, the program that was supposed to help Jean, stayed silent. No outreach, no cooperation, no apologies. The Gonzalez family began to suspect the organization never had a proper intake system to begin with. They were one of many rehab programs in the mainland that preyed on vulnerable Puerto Rican addicts, often flying them in,
using them for labor, then discarding them if they relapsed or rebelled. It was part of a larger problem that journalists would only begin to uncover years later. Still, the family kept pushing. At holidays, Jean's name remained on gift lists. On his birthday, his kids would draw pictures and ask questions that no one could bear to answer. Is Daddy lost? Is he working far away? Is he coming back? Vilmarilis aged with the search. She grew from a desperate teen sister into a woman hardened by bureaucracy and longing. She took jobs that allowed her flexible hours so she could make calls during government office times. She taught herself how to read police code, how to talk to journalists, how to not cry when she got stonewalled by a coroner's assistant who couldn't be bothered to check a 15-year-old file. The hardest part wasn't the grind. It was the doubt. Because over time, your memory starts to betray you. You begin to ask, did I get the date wrong? Was it really that program? Did he mean to disappear? Grief without evidence becomes self-doubt. And self-doubt becomes shame. And shame is what systems count on to keep people quiet. But the Gonzalez family never went quiet. They created digital archives. They worked with missing persons groups. They submitted his DNA to a voluntary Puerto Rican registry, just in case someone, somewhere, compared it to a John Doe. And then in early 2025, 17 years after Jean vanished, something changed. Vilmarilis was on Facebook, scrolling past the usual noise when she saw a post in a group for families of missing persons. A volunteer had shared a facial reconstruction from the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. It was a digital composite, clay-like, stylized, aged.
It's strange what finally breaks a mystery open. Not a detective, not a revelation in a file, not a confession in a courtroom, but a Facebook post shared by a volunteer in a group made for mothers of the missing. No clickbait, no dramatic filters, just an image and a caption. Unidentified male found in Chicago, September 2007. Facial reconstruction generated from remains. Please share if you recognize him. That was it. And that was enough. When Vilmarilis saw the image, she didn't gasp, she didn't cry, not at first. Instead, something inside her body just stopped, like a skipped heartbeat, a small internal halt, like the moment you miss a step and your brain registers danger before your feet do. The face in the photo wasn't perfect. Reconstructed faces never are. The skin tone was off, the expression blank. But there were details that pierced the fog. The curve of the cheekbone, the angle of the chin, the slight droop on one eyelid. It looked like Jean, or rather, it looked like Jean might look if 17 years had hardened his boyish face. She called her mother, sent the picture. Her mother went silent, then said only this, "I've seen that face in my dreams." That was all Vilmarilis needed. She messaged the page that posted the photo. They gave her the case number and contact at the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. She called that same day. Not frantic, focused. The way you are when your mind is ahead of your body, when you've waited so long for a crack in the wall that the light almost burns. The woman on the other end of the phone was kind. She listened. She didn't interrupt. She pulled up the file.
And for the first time since 2007, the official record met the family's story. A male, Hispanic, early 20s. Found in an alley off 79th Street. No wallet, no ID. But a handwritten note tucked in his shirt with the name Jean-Eli González. That's when Vilmarilise felt her knees give a little way. The note. He'd tried to make sure they could find him. But no one had checked. No one had believed it. She submitted documentation. Jean's photos, dental records from Puerto Rico, the missing persons report that had gathered digital dust. But most importantly, she submitted her DNA. Cook County compared it to the remains, a process that, in previous decades, would have taken months. Now, with updated protocols and the non-use interface, it was weeks. When the results came back, the call wasn't long. "It's a match," they said. 3 words. But for a family that had lived in the question mark for nearly 2 decades, those 3 words landed like a bomb. Not because they were shocking. They weren't. In her bones, Vilmarilise already knew. But because they made it real. Final. Confirmed. And suddenly, time caught up all at once. Jean had been dead for 17 years. He had died 2 days after arriving in Chicago. He had never made it to the program. He had tried to leave a clue. He had not been lost in the wilderness or murdered in some secret scheme. He had been right there, in a system that should have seen him, recorded him, honored him, but instead buried him under the label John Doe 428. Vilmarilise asked to see everything: the ME file, the burial location, the autopsy report, the original note. What she got in return was a brutal catalog of indifference. A paper trail not of malice, but neglect. The morgue had noted the name in the pocket and moved on. No one cross-checked it with the missing persons database. No one called Puerto Rican authorities. No one thought to ask whether a man who had clearly tried to ID himself might have people looking for him. Instead, he was processed like many others, with just enough paperwork to be buried, but not enough to be found. And that's what made this so bitter, because it could have been prevented. Jean didn't need a miracle. He needed a clerk to run a name. He needed a policy that required cross-checks with the national database. He needed someone, anyone, to treat that note like a life preserver instead of a footnote. By 2025, changes had finally begun. Non-use was being used more widely. Old cases were being digitized. Facial reconstructions were being posted publicly. Volunteer groups were filling in the gaps. But for Jean, all of that came 17 years too late. And yet, something happened after the match that no one expected. When Vilmarilise shared the story, first privately, then in the missing persons group, then with journalists, the response was massive. People who had never known Jean shared his photo. Mothers reached out saying they remembered the case. Some said they too had sons lost in that same Chicago neighborhood. Activists began asking questions about programs like Segunda Vida and how many others like Jean had arrived with hope and vanished into red tape. AARP picked up the story, not because Jean was old, but because his mother's pain mirrored that of so many aging parents still searching for their children. Even Reddit got involved. The r/unresolved mysteries community dissected the timeline, confirming just how badly the system had failed. What had once been a lonely search became a collective reckoning. Jean wasn't just a case anymore. He was a story, a face, a warning, and finally, a name returned to the record.
After the call confirming the DNA match, the silence that followed was different. Not the hollow, suffocating silence of not knowing. This was the quieter, stranger silence of finally knowing and realizing how much had been stolen by the delay. In the 17 years Jean lay in an unmarked grave, life did not pause. His children grew up. His mother grew older. His sisters built families of their own, each milestone shadowed by the one person who was always missing. He missed birthdays, graduations, the birth of his nieces and nephews, family reunions that never felt quite whole. But the hardest part, they would all say later, wasn't just what Jean missed. It was what the family had to carry in his absence. You don't just mourn a missing person. You build an entire life around the space they leave behind. You arrange holidays around unanswered questions. You keep a suitcase packed in case a body turns up. You talk to a ghost who might still be alive, and that messes with the soul in ways no funeral ever could. Vilma, in particular, bore a weight most siblings never will. She became the unofficial archivist of Jean's memory, keeper of photos, collector of paperwork, translator of grief into action. She was the one who called offices, chased rumors, learned the legal language of the system that failed them. She was the one who had to look her mother in the eye and say, year after year, "No news, but I'm still trying." And for all those years, Jean's name was absent from the public record. Not because he did something wrong, not because no one was looking, but because the systems meant to track the dead simply hadn't been designed to work for people like him. He was Puerto Rican, a U.S. citizen, but one who had to board a plane to access many basic services. He was poor, sent to a rehab program not out of choice but desperation. He was brown, male, and struggling with addiction, a combination that rendered him invisible in the eyes of most bureaucracies. And yet what was most devastating was this. Eli González did everything he was supposed to do. He accepted help. He showed up. He wrote his name down. And still, he vanished. Why? Because there were no protocols in place to connect his note to a missing persons report. Because there were no outreach programs to contact families in Puerto Rico when unidentified bodies appeared in Chicago. Because the county didn't upload his file to the national database until nearly 2 decades later. The cost of forgetting wasn't just emotional. It was procedural. It was baked into the system. It was the absence of bridges between morgues and missing persons units. The absence of bilingual staff who could follow up with leads from Spanish-speaking families. The absence of urgency when the victim wasn't white, wealthy, or well-connected. And perhaps most chillingly, the absence of anyone who thought, what if this man had someone who loved him? It would be easy to say Jean fell through the cracks, but that would imply the cracks were small. They weren't. They were vast, gaping trenches, ones carved by decades of underfunded systems, racial blind spots, and a deeply American tendency to treat some lives as more grievable than others. When the match was finally made, when the name was restored, the system did not offer an apology. There was no ceremony, no letter, no statement from Cook County acknowledging the failure. Instead, it was Vilma and her family who took the lead, again. They raised funds for a proper headstone. They contacted cemetery officials to locate the exact plot where Jean had been buried.
They planned a small private service, 17 years late, but no less sacred. On the day of the ceremony, the headstone bore a simple inscription: Jean Eli González, 1984 to 2007. We found you. Those 3 words, "we found you," were not just about locating a body. They were a declaration of love, of defiance, a reminder that even if the system had forgotten Jean, his family never did. They had found him, through tenacity, through love, and through the refusal to let a name become a number. In the days that followed, something began to shift. Journalists picked up the story. Advocates began referencing Jean's case in conversations about reform. Families of other missing Puerto Rican men reached out, saying they now believed their sons too might be among the unidentified in mainland morgues. The pressure grew, and slowly institutions began to respond. Cook County reviewed other unidentified cases from the same time frame. NAMIS expanded its outreach to Spanish-speaking communities. In Puerto Rico, grassroots organizations began compiling lists of citizens sent to mainland rehab programs, a first step in tracking the vulnerable before they vanished. Jean's story, in death, had sparked something no one expected: change.
In the weeks following Jean's identification, one phrase echoed through Vilmarles's mind, again and again: Segunda Vida, the name of the program that was supposed to help him. Translated literally, it means second life. But for Jean, it had been a last stop, a final chapter disguised as a fresh start. When he boarded that flight to Chicago in 2007, Jean wasn't running from anything. He was running toward something. He wanted to get clean. He wanted to be present for his children. He wanted to beat back the weight of addiction and carve out a future that didn't feel like punishment. Segunda Vida had promised all of that. Their pitch was familiar to struggling families across Puerto Rico: a stateside rehabilitation opportunity, fully covered, with housing, treatment, and even job training. But what few realized, until it was too late, was that many of these programs operated with almost no oversight. Segunda Vida wasn't the only one. Across cities like Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia, an entire underground pipeline had formed: vulnerable men flown from the island to the mainland, funneled into housing with minimal staffing, and then abandoned if they didn't comply with strict, sometimes arbitrary rules. No therapy, no social workers, no follow-up plans. They were told, "You're getting a second chance, don't blow it." But for many, it wasn't a second chance. It was a trap. Because once they arrived, they had no ID, no money, no legal recourse. If they pushed back or relapsed, they were kicked out. And if they vanished, no one sounded an alarm. Most of these men were sent by churches. Not maliciously, but out of desperation. Pastors in Puerto Rico, overwhelmed by addiction crises and lacking local resources, latched onto any solution that sounded hopeful. They raised funds to pay airfare. They said goodbye at airports, believing they were doing the right thing. But what they didn't see, what no one saw clearly enough, was the machinery beneath. These programs were cheap to run, lightly regulated, and dependent on a constant churn of arrivals. In some cases, the treatment consisted of sleeping on floors, attending daily prayer meetings, and cleaning church buildings in exchange for housing. And when someone like Jean disappeared, it wasn't just plausible. It was expected. Because these men weren't tracked, their departures weren't logged. No caseworkers followed up. There was no database of arrivals or dropouts. When Jean went missing, Segunda Vida didn't even notify his family. They didn't return calls. They didn't send a report. They simply moved on to the next arrival. That was the system. Or more accurately, that was the lack of one.
And it worked only because families like Jean's didn't have the resources to challenge it. In 2008, a small investigation by a Chicago journalist tried to shine a light on the issue, profiling a handful of men who'd vanished or died under similar circumstances. The story got buried, pushed off the front page by more immediate headlines. In 2014, a national advocacy group raised concerns about interstate addiction rehabs with unclear licensing. A white paper was drafted. It went nowhere. It wasn't until Jean's story surfaced, not as an isolated case, but as the product of a broken system, that people began to connect the dots. It wasn't just a tragic oversight, it was a pattern. And behind that pattern were names, lives, families. One man, Luis, had vanished after being sent to a New York program in 2010. His mother had never heard from him again. Another, named Javier, was found deceased in 2013 in Philadelphia. It took 8 years before his brother stumbled across a photo in an unidentified case archive. These weren't just forgotten men. They were fathers, brothers, sons. They were people who had tried. And their journeys had been stolen, not by a single villain, but a structure that made their erasure easy. The reckoning that followed Jean's identification didn't come in the form of arrests or lawsuits. It came in the form of questions. Why wasn't there a national registry for rehab program enrollees? Why weren't families given regular updates? Why didn't cities track the outcomes of these programs or even verify that they were licensed? Why was it so easy to lose someone? And perhaps most painful of all, why did it take 17 years for one man's life to matter enough to ask? For Vilmarilis, these weren't rhetorical questions. She began to speak publicly, not for attention, but to prevent the silence from swallowing anyone else. She gave interviews. She joined advocacy panels and worked with missing persons groups to create resources for families whose loved ones had entered mainland rehab programs. She did it all while still grieving. Because grief, for her, had always walked beside action. Because silence had already cost them too much.
There is something sacred about a name, not the way it's written in ink on a form, but the way it lives in a mother's voice when she calls for her son, the way it echoes in stories, in memories, in whispered prayers. A name carries presence. It makes a person real. For 17 years, Eli González's name had been detached from his body, buried under John Doe, erased from the records, absent from the headlines, muted by the very systems that were supposed to remember him. But his family remembered. They spoke his name at birthdays, at holidays, on random Tuesdays when grief crashed in like a wave and left the room suddenly quiet. And now, finally, the world began saying his name again, not as a case file, not as a footnote, but as a person. After the DNA confirmation, Vilmarilis returned to Chicago with a small group of loved ones. Not for justice. That word felt hollow now, but for something just as urgent: dignity. They visited the Cook County Cemetery where Jean-Eli had been buried, a long, flat field with row after row of numbered markers. His plot had no headstone, just a plain slab of concrete with a number etched in rust. No date, no name, no trace of the man beneath. It was a sobering sight, one that confirmed what they had always feared. Jean hadn't just died, he had been forgotten by design. Vilmarilis stood over the marker for a long time. Then she placed her hand flat against the cement and whispered the words her family had spoken in private for years. "We never stopped looking for you.
Later, they held a small memorial, nothing flashy, just close family and a few friends, gathered around a new headstone they'd paid for out of pocket. It read, Jean-Eli González, 1984-2007. Son, brother, father. Loved, found. That last word, found, carried weight. Because being found isn't just about locating a body. It's about restoring humanity, restoring narrative, restoring truth. It's about turning back the slow erasure that happens when someone disappears and the world keeps spinning. For Vilmariles, this moment wasn't closure. Closure implies finality, an end. But her grief hadn't ended. Her love hadn't ended. What changed was the silence. It finally had shape. It had answers. It had a name. That mattered. Because for too long, Jean had been a question. Now he was a story. And stories can move people in ways that statistics never will. In the months that followed the memorial, Jean's story continued to ripple outward. State lawmakers in Illinois began exploring reforms to how unidentified decedents are processed. NamUs expanded training for coroners and medical examiners, emphasizing cross-checks and outreach protocols for families with language barriers. A nonprofit began compiling a database of Puerto Rican citizens sent to rehab programs in the mainland U.S., a tool families could use to track their loved ones and flag irregularities. None of this erased what happened, but it meant something. It meant Jean didn't disappear for nothing. He became a catalyst, not by choice, but by truth. And in that truth, other families found strength. A mother in San Juan, who hadn't heard from her son since 2015, said she felt less alone. A pastor in Bayamón stopped referring parishioners to mainland programs without first verifying their credentials. A volunteer in Chicago began translating missing person reports into Spanish just in case. These weren't grand gestures. They were shifts, quiet revolutions, the kind that change futures one decision at a time. And at the center of them all was a man who never asked to be a symbol. Jean just wanted to get better, to come home, to see his kids grow up. He wanted a second life. He didn't get one. But maybe, just maybe, he gave that chance to someone else. Today, if you search Jean-Eli González's name, you'll no longer find a dead link. You'll find a face, a timeline, a story. You'll find his name carved into a headstone that says, "We found you." You'll find his sister's voice in interviews. You'll find volunteers saying they were inspired to keep going because of him. And in some quiet corner of Chicago, where a grave once held only a number, you'll find the truth. That remembrance is an act of resistance. That to speak a lost name is to resurrect a lost person. That even in systems built to forget, love remembers, always.